22 years ago, before the ink on the adoption papers had dried. Three small girls were sitting cross-legged on a cold tile floor outside the principal's office of a public elementary school in northern Ohio, sharing one sleeve of butter crackers between them. Their names were Ania, Marin, and Sol. They were 5, 4, and 3 years old. Their mother had died in a county hospital bed the previous winter. Their father had been gone since before any of them could form the consonants of his name. And that morning, in that hallway, the assistant principal had looked down at them the way people look at something they have not yet decided what to do with, and she had said, with the soft clinical pity reserved for cases that will not end well, "We'll try to find you all a home. Together if we can, but I won't lie to you, babies, the system doesn't like to place 3 at once." Ania had reached over and tucked the last cracker into her younger sister's hand. She didn't know then that this small gesture, this quiet redistribution of what little she had, would become the central grammar of her entire life. She didn't know that the man walking down that hallway right then, the man pushing a wide yellow mop bucket with frayed yellow ropes for handles, would become the reason 3 children nobody wanted would grow up to walk through the heavy oak doors of a federal courtroom in tailored charcoal suits and read a judge the truth that no one in that courtroom was ready to hear. His name was Walter Bell. He was 51 years old. He had worked the night shift at that same school for 19 years. He had a small apartment above a tire shop on the east side of town, where the windows fogged every morning from the heating unit under the floor. He had a deep scar along the back of his right hand from a warehouse accident in his 30s. He had a late-model sedan with a check engine light that had been on for 8 years. He had no wife, no children, no living parents, no savings above $400 in any given month. He had a quiet, decent, invisible life, the kind of life that does not get written down. Walter had been walking down that hallway, not eavesdropping, just walking, when he heard the assistant principal say the words nobody wanted. And something in him, something that he did not have words for and probably never would, just stopped. He stood with the mop bucket handle in both hands. He did not know the first thing about raising children. He had never even held a newborn. He had failed his own life in most of the ways a person is supposed to keep a record of. But he knew in the part of himself that does not consult logic that he could not walk past that hallway without saying something. So he said it. He cleared his throat. The assistant principal turned. The 3 little girls looked up. He said, "I'll take them." The assistant principal laughed, not unkindly, more the laugh of someone who has heard too many versions of this from too many well-meaning people. "Mr. Bell, with respect, you work here. You're a single man on a janitor's salary. You have no relatives who'd qualify. You don't even have a second bedroom." "I know," Walter said. "I'll figure out the bedroom part." And then, with the kind of calm that comes from a man who has already decided and is just waiting for the world to catch up, "I have a couch." She laughed again. Softer this time, but it was the laugh of someone already preparing the report she'd have to write if this man walked away with these children and hurt them, and she was not yet sure he wouldn't. "Mr. Bell, take my number. Think about it overnight. These girls have been passed around between 4 foster homes in 8 months. They need stability. I've been thinking about my life for 51 years, Walter said. Tonight I'm not going to think. I'm going to do." Before we go any further into Walter Bell's life, and into the strange and tender way it bent itself around 3 small girls who had no one else, take a moment, if you're listening to this in the quiet of your own evening, to press that small red button beneath this story. Subscribe and ring the bell, because stories like this only survive in the world when people like you decide they still matter. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. He took them home that weekend in the back seat of his sedan, with the check engine light glowing like a small patient sunrise. He had bought, between his shift and the signing of the temporary guardianship papers, 3 small pillows from the discount shelf at a department store, 3 toothbrushes, 3 plastic cups with cartoon characters on them. He had also bought, with a seriousness that surprised even him, 1 framed photograph. He stood in his kitchen that first night and looked at the photograph he had pulled from the file the social worker had given him. It was a small portrait of the girl's mother. He had never met her. But he put the frame on the second shelf of a bookcase he already owned, between a paperback dictionary and a folded road map of Ohio, and he said, out loud to no one, "I will not let them forget where they came from. And I will not let where they came from be the only thing they know." Ania, who was 5 and already understood more than a child should, climbed onto the arm of the couch that first night and asked, in the soft, careful diction of a child who has learned to ask permission for everything, "Are you going to leave us like the others?" Walter looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "No, baby, I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me." He paused. Then, because he was a man who understood the importance of small, concrete gestures, he reached into his back pocket, took out his wallet, and pulled out a thin $20 bill. He folded it twice and pressed it into her hand. "Put that somewhere safe. By the time you're old, you'll be rich." Ania nodded with the gravity of a chief executive signing an agreement. She put the bill, folded into a perfect square, into the sock drawer of the dresser she would now share with her sisters. That 20 remained there until her 15th birthday. By then there were 780 of them, each one creased and dated in her small, careful handwriting on the back. That is how Walter Bell began to be a father. He was not good at it. He was clumsy at bedtime stories because he had never heard one as a child. He burned pancakes on a near-religious basis. He sewed a torn school uniform hem with thread the wrong color, and did not notice until Marin pointed it out gently on picture day. He forgot once to pick the girls up after school, and he found them sitting on the front steps of the locked school, sharing a juice box in the dark. And he did not forgive himself for that for 6 years. But he was steady. He was there every morning, every evening, every scraped knee, every parent-teacher conference he attended in his janitor coveralls because he did not own anything else. He taught Ania to throw a baseball in the empty lot behind the tire shop on Saturday mornings. He taught Marin to ride a bicycle one summer on a long stretch of empty road outside town. He held Sol on his hip at the grocery store until he could no longer hold her on his hip, and then she rode on his shoulders until she could no longer ride on his shoulders. And then she walked beside him, hand in his pocket, until she no longer needed to hold his hand at all. He was the only father they had, and they were the only children he had. And in the particular algebra of American life that no book ever quite explains, 3 orphan girls who had nowhere to go found a janitor who had no one to come home to. And they made a family out of one another in the most improbable and quiet way a family is ever made. And then the years did what years do. Ania Bell, the eldest, would grow out of her childhood the way certain children do, all at once, like a tree deciding in one season to become as tall as the next one. By 13, she had begun to lose patience with the helplessness of her own house. She read her father's paycheck stubs at the kitchen table when he left them folded by the coffee pot. She knew that Walter's salary had not changed in 11 years. She knew that the apartment above the tire shop was still the apartment above the tire shop. She knew that her father's hands were getting older faster than his face. She did not, at 13, know what to do about this. But she began to keep a small green notebook, hidden between the dictionary and the folded road map on the second shelf of the bookcase, in which she wrote, every night, things she intended to fix. One of those things was, I will become a lawyer so that nobody takes advantage of my father again. She underlined the sentence twice and went to bed. Marin, 2 years younger, had inherited Walter's patient, methodical, slightly stubborn temperament. She did not declare things. She built things. By 16, she had taken the bus 40 minutes across town, twice a week, to volunteer in the office of a small real estate attorney named Leonard Pratt, who had advertised for help folding mailers and ended up with a teenage girl who reorganized his entire filing system by her third week and quietly corrected 2 of his closing arguments within the year. Leonard called her after her second year, the most accurate legal mind in this firm, and she is not yet a citizen. Sol, the youngest, was the quietest of the 3, and in some ways the most quietly fierce. By 17, she was working nights at a 24-hour diner 2 towns over, paying her own bus fare, putting money into a small savings account her father did not know about. She had accepted a state university offer at a different school, 300 miles closer, so she could still be home in time to make Walter breakfast on Sunday. Each of them, in her own way, was becoming the woman the title of this story has already promised you she will become. Each of them was also becoming, in the ordinary hidden ways that families rarely notice until they look back, the kind of person who understands what it feels like to be ignored by systems that are supposed to care about you. Walter, meanwhile, did not know any of this yet. Or rather, he knew it the way a man knows the weather is changing without being able to name the day. He noticed Ania reading the backs of cereal boxes for the listed nutritional values. He noticed Marin practicing debate phrases under her breath in the bathroom mirror. He noticed Sol leaving early for a part-time job she had never mentioned. He did not understand what it was. He worried sometimes, in the small, private, worried way he had of worrying, that he had done something wrong, that the girls were studying too hard because they were afraid of what their life was, that they were carrying his poverty on their backs as if it were a small animal they had agreed between them to protect. He sat one night at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed, and he looked at the framed photograph of their mother on the second shelf. And he said very softly, "I hope they forgive me for the house." He did not know that the oldest girl was standing in the hallway around the corner, listening with her hand over her mouth, and that she would never, for the rest of her life, forget the sentence. The girls grew. They graduated. They left one by one in the slow ceremonial way that children do, with a single duffel bag each and a promise that they would call on Sundays. Walter drove each of them to her college dormitory in the same sedan with the check engine light still glowing. He did not say much. He hugged each of them at the curb. He drove home. He parked in the lot behind the tire shop. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he went upstairs. He did not turn on the television that night. He did not eat dinner. He sat at the kitchen table, in the apartment that was suddenly much too large, with the framed photograph on the second shelf. And he folded his hands and did not pray because he had never learned how, but he was quiet in the way that prayer is supposed to be quiet. And the world, as the world will, began to behave toward Walter Bell the way the world behaves toward men who have spent their lives doing small, decent things in places no one looks. In his 23rd year at the school district, Walter was accused by the district's new operations director, a man named Randall Croft, of having misappropriated a small portion of the supply budget for the night janitorial team. The accusation was not true. Walter had, in fact, been the one who had caught the discrepancy 3 months earlier and had reported it through the proper channels to a principal who had since left. The new director, who had been hired to clean house in his own particular way, had decided that the easiest way to absorb the bad attention was to redirect it at a man on the night shift who had no union protection, no public profile, and no advocate in the building. Walter was suspended, then he was formally charged. The charge eventually escalated to a misdemeanor count of willful conversion of public funds, a category of crime in Ohio that carries, when it is positioned correctly, the possibility of significant jail time for a man of Walter's age and health. A separate civil suit was filed by the district seeking the recovery of $9,000, which was the exact amount of the discrepancy Walter had originally reported. The criminal case was assigned to a judge named Helen Vasquez, known in the local bar for her fairness, but also for her impatience with procedural theatrics. Walter did not understand what was happening. He knew he hadn't done it. He knew there were emails. He knew there were records. He did not know how to make any of that matter inside a courtroom where the words moved quickly, and the people using them wore suits he could not afford. He received a public defender, a young man 2 years out of law school, who was, by his own later admission, overwhelmed. Walter did not blame him. He only nodded politely at each meeting and tried to answer each question with the calm of a man who has accepted something he cannot change. The arraignment was scheduled for the second Tuesday of October. Walter drove himself to the courthouse that morning in the sedan with the check engine light. He parked in the far corner of the lot. He walked in wearing the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray suit he had bought 15 years earlier at a thrift store for Soul's middle school graduation, with the cuffs altered once by a neighbor who could sew. He carried a single brown folder with the printed emails he had saved. He did not carry, this is important, any expectation of victory. He carried, instead, a small dignity that he probably could not have named if you had asked him. He sat at the defense table. He looked at the American flag behind the bench. He looked at the seal of the state of Ohio. He looked at his own hands on the table. He thought briefly of the girl's mother in the photograph on the second shelf. He thought, "I'm sorry, ma'am." I tried. And then the side door of the courtroom opened. 3 women walked in. They did not walk in like visitors. They did not walk in like witnesses. They walked in the way people walk into rooms they have practiced walking into, with their shoulders slightly pulled back, with their badges already turned forward, with the kind of measured pace that says, without saying, "We were expected here." The first one was Ania. She was 27. She had been sworn into the Ohio bar 11 months earlier. She was wearing a charcoal suit she had purchased 4 weeks earlier for a single specific occasion, though she had not told anyone which occasion. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun. Her shoes were low, black, polished. She carried a single leather folder with her own annotations in the margin. The second one was Marin. She was 25. She had graduated from the state university with the highest academic distinction in her class, and had clerked for 2 years for Leonard Pratt, her old mentor, before joining a mid-sized civil firm in the city where she specialized in administrative defense. She was wearing a slightly darker charcoal, almost charcoal blue, with a small silver pin on her lapel that Leonard had given her when she made partner track. The third one was Soul. She was 23. She was, as of 4 months earlier, the youngest associate ever hired by the public defender's office of her county, and she had been assigned. By a quiet administrative rotation she had requested in writing, to the courtroom where her father's case would be heard. She was wearing black. She had in her breast pocket a single folded $20 bill she had not shown to anyone. It was a new one. She had walked into a bank the morning of the arraignment and withdrawn $20 in cash, in honor of the gesture her father had made when she was 5. The 3 of them did not look at each other as they entered. They did not need to. They had rehearsed this entry, late at night, on 3 long phone calls the week before. They had agreed that the moment must be quiet. They had agreed that the moment must belong to Walter. They sat down in the front row of the gallery. They did not speak to anyone. They did not introduce themselves to the public defender, who looked up from his file, saw 3 women in suits, and had a sudden internal collapse of the bad kind. He would later say, in a quote that ended up in a small Cleveland newspaper feature that ran 8 months later, "I thought, in that moment, that the universe had decided to send this man some help. And I was happy to get out of its way." The judge entered. The case was called, the prosecution stood, the public defender stood, Walter stood, and then Ania stood. "Sister, sit down," the bailiff said, half rising. Ania looked at the bailiff. She looked at the judge. She said clearly, in the kind of voice that has been calibrated by 1,000 nights of practice in front of a bathroom mirror, "Your Honor, my name is Ania Bell. I am appearing today specially for the respondent, Walter Bell, to request, on the record, that I be permitted to substitute as lead defense counsel for the existing public defender, who has, in a prior communication with my office, agreed to step aside in favor of counsel of record with documented direct knowledge of the underlying facts." The courtroom went very quiet. The judge looked down at Ania, then she looked at Walter. Then she looked at the public defender, who, with the gentle surrender of a young man who had just been relieved of a weight he had been carrying badly, said, "Your Honor, the state has no objection. Counsel for the defense concurs with the substitution. Proceed," the judge said. And in that small word, in that small silence, something inside Walter Bell, who had been bracing himself for the specific humiliation of being defended badly, something inside him let go. Not all of the way, not yet, but a small crack opened, the kind of crack that in older structures lets light through. We are at the midpoint of Walter's life, and this is the moment to widen the lens for a moment, because Walter did not arrive in that courtroom alone. None of us ever do. There was a 4th-grade teacher named Irene Mosley who had, every Friday for an entire school year, packed an extra peanut butter sandwich in her lunch bag, because she had noticed that Walter's girls sometimes came to school without one. She had never mentioned it to Walter. She had never told anyone. 3 weeks after the arraignment, she came down to the courthouse on her lunch break, sat in the back row with a folded tissue, and cried quietly for a man whose name she had only ever heard over the intercom. There was a guidance counselor at the middle school, Tom Boateng, who had spent 3 extra hours a week over 4 years helping Sol with her reading. He had a son in college. He knew what it cost. He never charged. He came to the sentencing hearing in a tie he had clearly just learned to knot, and he held it together until Sol was done speaking. And then he went outside and stood under a tree and cried without sound. There was Leonard Pratt, the small real estate attorney in the next town over, who had let Marin sit in his office as a teenager for 5 years. He wrote, on his own time, after the arraignment, a 14-page procedural memo on Ohio administrative defense that Marin would later cite in her oral argument. He did not come to the hearing. He was, he said with a small embarrassed laugh, bad at that kind of thing. There was the girl's mother. She had been dead for 22 years. She could not have known any of what was about to happen. But Ania had taken the framed photograph off the second shelf that morning, before leaving for the courthouse, and had carried it in the inside pocket of her suit jacket to the bench. It was not used in evidence. It was not displayed. It was simply inside her coat next to her heart like a second pulse. This is the kindness chain. It is not a metaphor. It is the actual structure of how a quiet man's life was held, by people who did not advertise what